Evidently, Persia has Israel by the short ones. Live from deep in the hood, this is the Eurasian Century. Okay, so we got a lot to look at today. First, later on, I'm going to talk about the war in Israel and what I think has happened as far as how it got started and where it's going. But first, I want to talk a little bit about current history and past history. Um, since the 1970s, American policy has been guided by the idea that you want to separate China and Russia. You want to keep that those two from having a synergy type alliance. Um, Nixon sent Kissinger to Beijing in order to open up China back in the early 70s, and then Nixon himself went to China. He was a stalwart anti-communist, and so he had the clout to be able to do that. Um, so shortly thereafter, we removed our recognition of Taiwan as the Republic of China and switched it over to Beijing as the sole government of all China. And since then, we've recognized the one China policy, one China, two systems, that Taiwan is an integral part of China. All of that was done, at least ostensibly, in order to separate the People's Republic of China from the Soviet Union. Um, Now, more recently, as in since Vladimir Putin came to power, um, since I guess 2001, there has been a treaty of good neighborliness and friendly cooperation between Russia and China. And they have inched towards a more cordial and cooperative relationship. And significantly, in April of 2013, the two countries announced an emerging special relationship, they call it. Through the 20 teens, the interests of the two countries continued to merge because of sanctions systems that were imposed on Russia, especially after the Maidan coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014. And whatever barriers to close cooperation between the two seem to have melted away over that period. Um, so the Russia China relationship has moved towards a more formal alliance on economic matters and even to some extent military as well, because they do joint military exercises just between the two and also with other partners. This this relationship became kind of cemented in what I would call really a formal alliance. Um, we don't know everything that it entails because I'm sure not everything that it entails has been made public, but it was called or named a Partnership Without Limits. And this was announced in February of 2022. Not coincidentally, this was just before the Russian Ukraine war began. So that's Russia today, um, cozying up to the Chinese and the Chinese cozying up to Russia because they see um, mutual interests, especially vis-a-vis the United States, because the United States has been the global hegemon the global king, kind of, since the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. And over the last few years, they've gradually lost this status and are currently in the process of losing it. Um, and so they've kind of begun to lash out in all directions. The United States has. And Russia obviously realizes this from the westward or the eastward expansion of NATO. China also realizes this due to all the rhetoric around Taiwan and the challenges that they're facing in Southeast Asia, in the South China Sea. And so this is a alliance of convenience, alliance of mutual interests. That's not even getting into really the energy question, because what's happened since the regime of sanctions in that were due to the Ukraine war is that Russia has pulled back from its focus on Europe and has switched its energy export to China and India and other Eastern recipients. So now all that oil and gas, or a lot of it, there's still some that, especially last year, that went to Europe. Um, but they are pivoting and have secured a market for their oil and gas with China and India. China is a huge manufacturing power. And so it makes perfect sense that with all those natural resources just to the north of them, that, it's a marriage made in heaven, really. Um, this threat from the West and alliance with the East has a parallel or a prior reference in Russian history. If you go back to the 13th century, in the middle of the 13th century, Russia faced a serious challenge. The Mongols were threatening from the southeast, the Teutonic Knights were threatening from the west. Russia could not maintain both conflicts simultaneously. So a prince named Yaroslav II of Vladimir decided that the best thing for Russia to do was to enter an agreement with the Mongols. The Mongols did not require anybody to adopt their culture or their religion. The Mongols were just they were shamanists. They had it's kind of a nature worship type religion that they had, and they weren't interested in exporting it. It wasn't an evangelical project with them. The Teutonic Knights, on the other hand, would have required the Russians to convert from Holy Orthodoxy to Roman Catholicism. So Yaroslav, he made submission, or made a treaty of submission with the Mongol state, and that way he was free to, and Russia was free to turn and deal with the threat from the West. So, having secured his eastern flank, Yaroslav's son, Prince Alexander of Novgorod, and he was prince of other things as well later on, turned on the Teutonic Knights, and there was an early battle fought, I think when he was 19 years old. It was on the banks of the Neva River, and winning that battle for his trouble, Prince Alexander was called Alexander of the Neva, or Alexander Nevsky. And later on, after several more um, battles and successes against uh, the West, he fought a battle on the it was actually on a frozen body of water called the Battle on the Ice, and that was probably the most famous of the battles during that period. And he was later canonized as the Holy Prince Alexander Nevsky. Um, Vladimir Putin essentially made the same choice that Nevsky did. He decided to treat with the Chinese, not the Mongols, but the Chinese. Um, and it's not as a subservient um, partner, but a an equal partner, at least an equal partner with the Chinese. Because the Chinese have no intention of imposing their political ideology on Russia. Russia has been, in the past, a communist state. And one can say the same thing about China. China has been a communist state in the past. However, both of them moved away from um, having the public sphere being the universal sphere. Now, both of them are hybrid of both public and private ownership of the means of production. Um, China still maintains the name on the door as the Chinese Communist or the Communist Party of China, but it's only communist in name. It doesn't function as a communist society. It has a communist party that dominates the country, but they are nationalists. They don't nationalize. They don't they don't nationalize the means of production. They don't make the state the sole owner of the means of production. So Russia doesn't see any danger from that. Doesn't see any danger from Chinese religion. Sees only opportunity from the Chinese market, manufacturing, and being able to supply them with resources. And they see the Chinese have made their peace with state capitalism, and they're not particularly concerned about the Chinese. Um, Western forces, on the other hand, exploited Russia in the 1990s under Yeltsin, uh, and have perpetually expanded NATO and their liberal ideology, which is their religion, as being superior and inevitably replacing Russian Orthodox Christian sensibilities. And so that does concern the Russians. Putin came to this game, admittedly, belatedly. He was much more enamored with the West earlier on in his life, and even during the early years of his presidency. But finally, he came to his senses and realized that America and the West can't respect anybody else in the world, and they want to reduce everybody else to some type of vassal of one to one degree or another. And Russia wasn't interested in that, and so Putin has decided to resist this whole project, and that's part of what Ukraine is about. It's part of what BRICS is about. And so um, perhaps at some point Putin will be known as Vladimir of Novorossiya, just like Alexander is known as Alexander Nevsky, because Novorossiya is that region going from the Donbass down along the southern coast of um, the Ukraine, which Russia has occupied and annexed, and thereby thrown a monkey wrench into the plans of America and the West. Um, So I wanted to get that part of it out of the way. That's all I'm going to say about the Ukraine conflict, just as an overview of what the background analogy in Russian history is. And the Russians are very historical people, in the sense that, well, as you could see from my first program, um, illiterate people quoting um, poetry is very much appreciated and lauded in Russian culture, and historical drawing historical parallels is also it, the one of the worst insults that you can receive from a Russian is to be called "nikulturny," which literally means uncultured, but has more of the force of barbarian. Um, so anyway, the I want to turn now to what's going on in the Middle East with the Israel Hamas situation. Uh, I am skeptical of the thesis held by some that the Hamas attack was CIA, Mossad controlled, or inspired, and that it is counterproductive to Palestinian interests. They base this, people who have this theory, and there are several of them. Brian Berletic is one, and there are others, that would come across online. And I have, great respect for a lot of these people, Berletic especially, and some of the people that I regularly interact with online. I just happen to disagree with them on this particular thing, but on 90% of issues, we generally agree. Um, they think that this is the case because Israel propped up Hamas as an alternative to Al Fatah in order to prevent the Palestinians from gaining statehood, because Hamas was opposed to a two-state solution. Fatah was not necessarily. And also based on the fact that Hamas fought Hezbollah and Iran in Syria on the side of the U.S. backed Islamic militants against the Assad government. Those facts are certainly true, but they do not mean that Hamas is just a cutout for the Israelis and America. I can understand why people think that, but you have to look a little bit more closely than that. Hamas is a radical organization which hasn't historically been that well funded, and has received money from different sources. Essentially, earlier in its existence, it was a mercenary force in a way, but it's also a religious force. It's more religious than Fatah and the PLO. Fatah runs the PLO. They were part of the secular Arab culture, similar to the Ba'ath culture that Assad was and Saddam Hussein was, social democratic, socialist type. That's kind of what the PLO was. Hamas is much more in your face, ostensibly religious. Its official name is the Islamic Resistance Movement. Hamas is an acronym based on that, based on the Arabic name. And so it's in charge of the Gaza government, but the economic base there is pretty thin, thanks to the Israelis and to other limitations. Um, Hamas is always looking to make a buck, and at times they've taken support from all sorts of unsavory characters, perhaps sinking as low as to receive funds from American agencies, certainly receiving funds from the Israeli government. However, lately, over the past few years, Hamas has been on Iran's payroll. Iran likes to deal with Hamas. Iran is implacably opposed to Israel, and likes to deal with Hamas much more than it likes to deal with the PLO, for the reason I just mentioned, that Hamas is a religious organization. As the years have gone by and the struggle against Israel has continued decade after decade, the rift between Shiites and Sunnis has become less and less important, given that they have a common enemy that they understand as the United States and as Israel. Now, America has been able to buy off some of the Sunnis, but this is not, the wind's not blowing in that direction, I don't think, at this point, because they sense another basis of world power arising in the East. Um, Hamas is largely funded by Iran through Qatar as an intermediary. It's supplied with weapons by Iran's Revolutionary Guard, probably through Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is the most likely source for the training that Hamas must have received in order to carry out the October 7th operation. None of that is particularly controversial. Um, the only question is really how much was Iran aware of what Hamas was doing, and how much Hezbollah was aware of what Hamas was doing on October the 7th. The particular operation, the particular planning, particular execution of it. But they trained them to do this stuff, and they supplied all the weapons, and they gave them money. So it's a curious line you would draw that, oh, well, maybe they weren't actually a part of the physical planning of Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. Maybe they weren't. Every arrow points to the idea that they were, other than their own denials, which are self-serving. But I suppose that's possible. I just don't think it's likely. I do not think that Hassan Nasrallah woke up on October the 8th, the day after Hamas's attack, and said, oh, those heretics, the Sunnis down in Palestine, they've made a major strike on Israel. Well, I'll step up our harassment of the Israeli forces in northern Israel, and I'll threaten to invade. And so we'll start, bombarding with missiles again. Not a high level exchange, but definitely stepped up from whatever ultra low level might have gone on before then. They effectively opened up a second front for Hamas the day after Hamas attacked. And we know where Hamas got its weapons, got its training, and everything. So if somebody wants to draw a line and say somehow Hamas just didn't tell them, Hezbollah just didn't happen to know, okay, but they're behaving exactly as they would otherwise. Iran has been cultivating a resistance network in the north of Israel towards the east, through Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Hezbollah, and down to Hamas, in order to combat U.S. and Israeli operations against Iran. They realize clearly that if they wait until the U.S. is on their border, it is too late. They've had that experience already with Saddam Hussein, and more recently with the Iraq War. And they wish to avoid that in the future, and the way to do that is to have a good offense as their defense. So, they've set up this resistance network um, in the West. I mean, the Atlantic Council calls it the resistance axis because the West now wants to call Russia, Iran, and China the new axis of evil, and North Korea, I guess. Um, but it's known as the resistance in the area. And when Hassan Nasrallah spoke the other day about the head of Hezbollah spoke about the situation. When he was talking about the resistance, he was talking about the entire network from uh, Iran through Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Hezbollah, and Hamas. It's all one thing in that it's um, a vehicle for Iran to defend itself, essentially. Um, so President Raisi of Iran is going to attend the Organization of Islamic Cooperation Summit in Saudi Arabia on Sunday to discuss the Israel-Hamas war. Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh met Ayatollah Khamenei in Tehran. Probably it was early November, according to Hamas. Um, it does not appear that there's any concern about Hamas being Sunni rather than Shiite. And Iranian proxies, the Houthi in Yemen, have been firing missiles at Israel since the Hamas attack. Um, Other Iranian proxies under the Revolutionary Guards and others have been attacking American bases in the Middle East since at least the time of Biden's visit to Israel, if not before. Now, I still believe that the Mossad turned a blind eye initially to the Hamas attack, thinking it could benefit from victim status, which they always seek, and to undertake an ethnic cleansing operation to drive the Gazans into the Sinai. Uh, I tend to shy away from the word genocide. People, other people, are happy to use it. You know, what happened to the Jews in Nazi Germany under Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, I consider to be a genocide. What happened to the Armenians under the Turks? Um, a million of them were killed. That is a genocide. Genocide literally means killing the entire tribe, killing the entire nation or people. Um, Killing 1,000, 10,000 people is not quite the same thing as killing the entire tribe. So um, now, internationally, as far as what the United Nations defines it as, I do not know, and I'm not particularly concerned. I just think that that word ought to have some impact when it's used, rather than being reduced to the point where, if 5 people of the same ethnic group are killed, somebody will call it a genocide. Um, but um, that ethnic cleansing operation that's intended to drive the Gazan Palestinians into the Sinai may not materialize due to the actions of Hezbollah, which are seemingly in some sort of coordination. Because what Hezbollah has said is, we'll hold off for now. All we'll do is start a campaign of harassment against Israel forces in northern Israel. But if it starts to look like Hamas needs our help, if Israel starts to succeed in eradicating them, or succeed in their attempt, looks like they're going to succeed in their attempt to drive the Palestinians south into Egypt. which they're trying to do, but they're the Israelis are around Gaza City right now, and it could be that they end up in a quagmire there. It certainly looks like it at this point, but we'll have to see. Um, but what the Hezbollah is saying is, if it looks like they're really gaining ground, we'll really go hard and heavy into northern Israel. We'll use some percentage of our rockets that we built up, and they probably have 150,000 of them, 120,000 of them. Nobody knows exactly. A lot of them precision rockets, and they could. The best estimates I've heard, they could overtake northern Israel and hold it for some period of time if they wanted to. Um, but they're going to hold off on doing that for the time being. But that fact, the mere fact that threat is there, causes the Israelis to place somewhere between a quarter and a half of various categories of their military assets, whether it's Navy, whether it's infantry, whether it's Air Force. They're expending a lot of their forces um, in deployment along the northern front because they are concerned by what Hezbollah might do due to its threats and due to its increasing on a daily basis the bombardment and the harassment in northern Israel. And it will probably continue to do so until Israel agrees to a ceasefire. Um, so this detracts significantly from Tzahal. Tzahal is the Israeli army. Tzabah Hagana Israel, the Army of Defense for Israel. Its acronym in Hebrew is Tzahal. It detracts from Tzahal's capabilities in Gaza, but it also means that if Israel begins to succeed, then Hezbollah holds a trump card and can open it up. Thus, even if the Mossad or Bibi or the neocons in D.C. thought that they might be able to milk an ethnic cleansing out of this, they were mistaken. But this all gets deeper because it really doesn't benefit, this whole thing doesn't really benefit Israel. That's what I've tried to demonstrate just now. But it doesn't necessarily benefit the United States either. Um, Anthony Blinken has been engaged, flitting around the Middle East, trying to arrange a ceasefire and or peacekeeping forces from neighboring Arab countries. The ceasefire was a no-go. Then it turned into a humanitarian pause. That was a no-go. And then we learned this morning that there is going to be a 4-hour period each day that Sahel has agreed to that where they can do humanitarian evacuation during that 4-hour period each day. But everybody gave Anthony Blinken the finger the whole time. He was in the Middle East. No sale, no way. The Arabs weren't having any, weren't listening to him when he talked about a peacekeeping force in Gaza. They just wanted a ceasefire, and they didn't want to hear anything else from him but a ceasefire. Biden does not want another war on his hands, another potential loser moving into an election year. Blinken is clearly trying to play past this. If I didn't mention it before, Blinken is the Secretary of State of the Biden administration. Blinken is clearly trying to play past this and trying to keep it from exploding and further sinking the Democrat chances next year. The Biden regime does not want a war with Iran at this point, in my humble opinion. If they did, They would not have said that Iran had no direct involvement in October 7th. Um, People ask me what the significance of the Wall Street Journal article that said, that reported that Hamas and Iran had met in Lebanon in the weeks leading up to the Hamas attack, and Iran greenlighted the operation. Um, that story was out there, and subsequent to its publication, the Israeli intelligence and American intelligence, without an internal assessment, because they didn't have time to do it by the time that they spoke, without an internal assessment, said that they didn't have any evidence that Iran was directly involved in the planning or execution of the operation. Now, if they wanted a war with Iran, that would be the natural way to get a war with Iran. To go ahead and say, yeah, they did it, both the Israelis and the Americans. But the Israelis don't want a wider war. And the Americans at this point don't want a wider war. The neocons want a wider war. Neocons definitely would like to go after Iran and just about everything that they've written since the thing happened, since the Hamas attack happened, point the fingers at Iran. That's why I think some people don't like my theory that Iran actually did have a hand in the Hamas attack. But I'm not advocating the same thing that the neocons are. I mean, I'm not really concerned that Iran had a hand in it. Um, so, if neither Israel nor the United States benefits from this, who does? Well, Iran, Russia, and China do. Weapons are leaving or failing to be funneled to Ukraine because of the Israel conflict. This helps Russia. Iran succeeds in polarizing the Islamic world against Israel and the U.S., and it succeeds in placing itself at the top of the U.S. Israel hit list, thus becoming a rock star among their fellow Muslims who all hate Israel. Turkey also is cashing in on this as well. They had a rally in Istanbul with 1.5 million people present, and Erdogan gave a fiery speech. I don't know that he's going to do anything, but he gave a fiery speech during it. So the Islamic world is up in arms, and the people are ready to go to war. It's just the leaders aren't quite ready to go to war. It scuttles the peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which was developing just after Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran were admitted to BRICS. This cuts off Israel from the emerging bloc that is forming around the Eurasian alliance. Iran can now ask the Muslim world, who's your daddy? And if they say anybody but Iran, they can say, which country are Israel and the United States talking about attacking? It ain't Saudi Arabia, and it ain't the UAE. It also benefits both China and Russia as potential neutral intermediaries, China more than Russia, in order to intervene at some appropriate time and fashion a solution to the whole mess that effectively reduces American influence in the Middle East. And this directly benefits both countries. China has the Belt and Road Initiative, which has routes that pass right through the Middle East, and they do not want America able to disrupt their new Silk Road by having an active, powerful American military base called Israel in the region. They would much rather have American and Israeli power reduced um, through having a Palestinian state established by some type of um, summit or coming together of countries, a peace summit type thing. Uh, it also fortifies Russia's emerging position in Syria and the region. Russia is, by Syrian invitation, Russia has forces in Syria in order to basically keep the West, America, from overthrowing the regime of Bashar al Assad. And they have a considerable presence, the Russians, in Syria. And what they've told Israel essentially is if you want to attack um, Iranian assets or independent assets, military assets in Syria that you think are causing mischief here, there, everywhere, and the same with the United States. If they want to attack them, Russia's not going to get in the middle of it. But if they try to attack the Assad government or if they attack Russian assets in Syria, then all bets are off and they'll intervene. Russia doesn't necessarily want to be in the middle of this if it can help it, but they did want to give a warning to the United States about the two carriers that are in the region now, because those carriers have weapons that could reach Russian assets in Syria, and so that was the warning that I mentioned last time that Putin gave about the MiG 31s with hypersonic missiles that could reach the carriers. Um, so, Russia, from when this happened, started raising a roar about America being the problem in the region. That's their mantra. And China is echoing this mantra or narrative at this point. The reason behind that is the neither the Russians nor the Chinese want a bad relationship necessarily with Israel. It might be inevitable for the Russians. We don't know yet. But I think what both of them would prefer would be that Israel morph into a state that is less dependent on the United States and more integrated with its neighbors, um, and especially with the Palestinian state neighboring it, and that it did not behave and was not thought of as an American military base or an American colonial asset, European colonial asset. Um, as Dr. Steve Turley has pointed out, the demographics in Israel are on the side of the Mizrahi Jews, the Eastern Jews, not the Ashkenazi Jews. And they form a majority in Israel already, and they're just now gaining traction as far as political power. Because it is possible for a minority to rule a majority, obviously. And up till now, that's happened. But Benjamin Netanyahu, though he is Ashkenazi, has kind of herded the religious parties and the Mizrahi into a coalition. And Netanyahu may disappear. He may go to jail. He's going to retire anyway, one way or the other. God only knows. But the Eastern Jews, the Mizrahi Jews, are not going anyplace, and they're still going to be a majority today, tomorrow, the next day, and in years to come, because they reproduce more fast. They reproduce more rapidly than Ashkenazi Jews do. Ashkenazi are the European Jews. Um, so, um, it's possible that Israel could morph into something that at least BRICS and the global South and the Eurasian Alliance could live with. I'm more skeptical that it's something that the Arabs could live with, Muslims, their neighbors could live with. But it is a fact that their neighbors were starting to conclude peace treaties with them. And the real thorn in people's side there is the Palestinian question. And if you had a Palestinian state, hopefully that would take some of the edge off of that. Um, Now, here's a little thought experiment. If one tries to maintain that this is all the neocons trying to start a war with Iran, as well as Israel manipulating Hamas, what one is left with is the assertion that Jewish neocons caused Hamas to stage attacks and caused Israel to stand down in their initial response in order to justify a war with Iran, which is dependent on getting Iran to intervene through Hezbollah. Hezbollah opening up a second front in northern Israel in order to justify blaming Iran for the whole mess. That's a whopper of a conspiracy theory there. I'm not saying that it's not possible, but the Occam's razor principle in me isn't quite that sanguine with that theory that really Hamas is controlled by Israel or neocons in the State Department or CIA. Especially given what they did and how this thing's playing out. But, I could be wrong. You never know. Um, but I think I've shown that the natural beneficiaries of this are really um, Palestinians, potentially, but also Iran, Russia, and China. Um, and I've given the reasons for that: Belt and Road, and Russia's presence in Syria, and the need to reduce American presence in the Middle East. Um, and so, if you have natural beneficiaries, generally you should look to them as being the likely instigators of whatever has happened. Um, Now, I want to do an aside about nuclear weapons and Iran's position with all this because it's misunderstood, and I've contributed to the misunderstanding probably by speculating as to whether Iran might have nukes that they just went ahead and produced, but haven't told anybody about. What's probably happened is, well, at some point, what has happened is Iran made the calculation that almost making a nuke is just about as effective as owning one. They've been able to make a nuke since about 2014, which is when they signed the JCPOA, because they had achieved all the steps they needed to do so. Once a nuclear program passes 20% enrichment, the remaining work to get 90% weapons grade uranium put into a warhead is not that difficult. I have to disagree with Alexander McCurse on this. The enriching the uranium, once you get up to a certain point, um, that's your main thing. Obtaining um, the actual explosive to put in the warhead. Designing and producing a nuclear weapon aren't that big a deal. Um, Now, Iran achieved 20% because this covers all its civilian purposes, and they announced that, and so there's no, that's um, a point where they could say, we got to 20%, we'll sign this agreement. They might do other things on the side, but they switched their focus probably at that point to making ballistic missiles. Because enriching uranium to weapons grade isn't that big a deal, what you need to do is have ballistic missiles, uh, hypersonic missiles that can um, carry the nuclear warheads wherever you want them to go. The further, the better for a deterrent. For deterrence, put it that way. This is why a lot of modern countries achieve 20% enrichment. Um, it gives them plausible deniability as far as a nuclear program is concerned, because that's what you need for nuclear power, civilian use. But if they want to bomb, it's just a few steps away. We know that Iran is enriched to 60%, considerable amounts to 60%, and there's trace evidence of reaching close to 90%. And we know they have an enriched stockpile large enough to build 5 to 10 bombs. What they're likely doing is using this as leverage for future nuclear negotiations, because they figured out the West has trained them to be able to milk rewards out of the United States for compliance with negotiations and treaties like this. Um, so, in any case, um, I'm going to close with two observations that some people are missing regarding some of the things that are going on. The first one has to do with Ukraine. It does not matter where Russia destroys Ukraine's army, but only that Russia destroys Ukraine's army. It's better to do it in the east, among Russian speaking peoples, amidst defenses constructed 4 layers deep that so far have proved impenetrable. And it's better to do it there than with strung out supply lines among a hostile population in the West, where the army is constantly subject to attack from all sides. Um, if you decisively destroy the army, the central government will collapse, because there's nothing really propping it up at that point, and everybody realizes that they're naked essentially. And you're starting to see some of that now with the intrigue. One of Zelensky's aides was killed by a package bomb, and there's infighting going on, and you can tell it's the end game over there. If the central government collapses, then you can put in a satellite government who will govern Western Ukraine as they are told, and they will take all the risks. Now, what does the world look like after Ukraine is defeated and American power is greatly diminished in the Middle East? Europe is currently in the process of political restructuring towards the right. There have been some elections that have gone one way or the other, but the trend over the past couple of years has been towards the right, getting a higher percentage of the vote in these elections. And of course, this has alarmed European governments, but there doesn't seem to be much they can do about it other than futile attempts to outlaw certain parties. As that progresses, over time, Europe will once again wish to resume trade with Russia and once again become energy dependent. In the Middle East, if the Eurasian Alliance's ally Iran becomes an even more major player and Israel is weakened by a Palestinian state, this will weaken its ability to reliably depend on America. Then the Eurasian Alliance has opened up Europe and the Middle East to it and to the BRICS Plus countries. Africa is already in the process of this transformation, And Argentina was just admitted to BRICS, fully opening up South America since Brazil was a founding member of BRICS. Now, the PRC imports half of its oil from the Middle East, um, and is the top oil customer of Saudi Arabia and Iran. Um, the Middle East and North Africa region represents the cornerstone of the PRC's Belt and Road Initiative, accounting for 28.5% of its investments in 2021. Um, China has comprehensive strategic partnerships with five Middle East and North African states: Algeria, Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, and strategic partnerships with seven: Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Morocco, Oman, Qatar, and Turkey. Um, Huawei has 12 5G contracts in the Middle East. From 2005 to 2022, Chinese investments and contracts in the Middle East and North Africa total $273 billion. In 2021, Chinese investment in the region increased by an estimated 360%, while construction rose by 116% relative to 2020. I'm reading off these statistics because the Belt and Road Initiative goes right through the Middle East, and the more secure the Middle East is for China, the better off China is. And China is certainly amenable to reducing America's influence and Israel's power in the Middle East. Um, Man, I'll spare you the rest of these statistics. But taking the above into consideration, if you look at the Eurasian Alliance and BRICS Plus as an economic cooperative and with military implications, they haven't hardened it openly into a military alliance yet, but everybody's wondering to what extent it is military. And if you look at Chinese efforts to expand its role in East Asia and the Pacific region, it's beginning to appear as though the Eurasian Alliance intends to contain the West. Perhaps you've seen maps of what has happened with NATO expansion and U.S. bases circling around uh, the Russian Federation, and also in East Asia, American assets trying to contain China. China and Russia are attempting to do the same thing now at this point, vis a vis the United States and the European Union, the collective West. And so I'll just close with the thought that I wasn't kidding in the first program that I made about this being a war. There is a real war going on between the West and the rest. And some places it's a shooting war, some places it's hybrid, asymmetrical warfare, but it is real. And I see at this point that the East, the rest, has the advantage. And I'll close with that.